Lucha-Masks.com, in partnership with Mask Republic, give you personal protective masks to keep you lucha strong in the fight versus COVID-19. With world-class luchadors Blue Demon Jr., the Lucha Brothers, LA Park, Ultimo Dragon, Cain Velasquez, Conan, and so much more. Head to Lucha-Masks.com and you too can become a masked warrior. Lucha-Masks.com, powered by Pro Wrestling Revolution.
You are listening to the Lucha Central Podcast Network. And now, LuchaCentral.com presents The Business of the Business.
Hey everyone, and welcome to another episode of Business of the Business, the only podcast that takes you inside the world of officially licensed merchandise and how it gets made, with an emphasis on the pro wrestling and lucha libre businesses. Welcome back to the show, and this week I have a very special guest, and it's a very timely episode, though I don't think we actually meant for it to be timed this way. Normally, this would be the week of San Diego Comic-Con, and for the last number of years, Masked Republic has been there every year. Last couple years, actually promoting our Luchaverse comic book series, but also we went just a number of years before that because it was a great way to bring Masked Republic into the pop culture, into the conversation, so to speak, and to be part of Comic-Con, being there for new releases, being there for having our stars sign at the booth. And one of the reasons that we've been able to be so successful with Comic-Con is because of the people we partner with when we go. A number of years back, we formed an alliance for Comic-Con, I guess you could say, so to speak, with Michael Kingston's Headlocked comic. Michael has been creating and writing Headlocked for a number of years now. And we'll get into all of that on the show this week because he is my guest. And right now, he is in the final stages of a Kickstarter for his latest comic from Headlocked, Tales from the Road 2. But we'll get into all those details, including why Kickstarter, what the difference of his approaches is when he's doing Kickstarter versus selling direct to consumers, how he works with the wrestlers that are involved with Headlocked Comic, because Headlocked is not just a comic book about the pro wrestling industry. And as you'll hear us describe it, it's really kind of a gritty drama, premium cable-esque drama about the pro wrestling business. But Michael has always worked with pro wrestlers in a very unique way when it comes to creating and building his world. From Jerry Lawler, the WWE Hall of Famer, doing the covers, to these Kickstarter versions that he makes where he has stories on which he collaborates with wrestlers and artists that are also wrestlers many times. So it's a really unique perspective, some version of licensing that we haven't really touched on before and probably won't anytime again soon, and the world of publishing and comic books and how that all relates. So my guest with me today is Michael Kingston of Headlocked Comics, because there's been multiple of them. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, while I will let Michael give his own version of it, to me, Headlocked Comic has always kind of been, if HBO or Showtime or premium cable decided to do a drama about professional wrestling, then they should be looking to Headlocked for what it is that they would be producing, essentially. It's a great, unique story world centered around pro wrestling. But on top of that, as part of the business model of Headlocked, Michael also does a lot of work directly with talent, coming up with stories for, I guess, what I would call supplemental versions of Headlocked. And that's really what I'm hoping that we get a chance to focus on today, because I don't think it's really ever been much talked about before. And that's obviously the kind of center of this podcast, where we talk about how officially licensed merchandise gets made. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Mike. And Mike, why don't you, I guess, start it off by giving our listeners, before we even get into how you started it, what is Headlocked? And if someone pick up a copy of Headlocked or start with, I guess, the first volume, what is that journey that they're about to enter into?
You kind of nailed it for me, but it's a kid who's a theater major in college who sort of falls in love with wrestling unexpectedly, and it sort of takes over his life. He gets the bug, he quits school, and it's his journey through the wrestling business. So to me, it's Headlock's always been about two things. It's been about like the art, wrestling as an art form, and about identity. So like how do you choose the things that you present to the world? And obviously as a wrestler, you have two of those things. You have your sort of character, and then you know who you are as a human. So I kind of those are some themes that we like to play around with. But ultimately, I feel like it's a HBO style drama, and it's the kind of thing that you might, you tune in at like 10 o'clock on a Sunday night to watch. And, hopefully that's kind of the feel that people get when they read it.
So I guess before we move forward in terms of the story and how you have developed your business model, let's I guess take a step back. What's your background, and how did you come to decide that Headlocked was going to be the focus point of your journey in comics? Because now, how many years now have you been doing Headlocked?
I mean, in terms of publishing, we published the first one in 2008. But obviously there were some years before that, because much like wrestling, comics is has a very weird, like, I don't know, like there's no rules kind of thing, and no one really tells you what you're supposed to do. It's a little more it's a little more out there now, in the same way that wrestling is now. But 12, 13, 14, 15 years ago, it was just, how do you do it? So, and I mean, I made every possible mistake. So there was a couple of years of flailing around, just trying to find a door. And then I realized I kind of had to make my own door. So
I definitely understand that approach to business, because I mean, that's why this podcast exists, in a way, is making those doors because they didn't exist, or because either I wasn't knocking on the doors that wanted me, or the doors that I wanted to knock on didn't exist. So I absolutely understand that. So I guess take us back. What was your personal journey to get to launching Headlocked?
So, I loved wrestling and comics my whole life, and just nobody ever made good wrestling comics. They were always sort of character based, like weird action things, like Undertaker fighting demons. And, I mean, the perils of licensed properties. Sometimes people license things because they think they can make a buck at it, and not necessarily because it's something they love. And I think that's where the disconnect comes sometimes between a product and its fan base. You make this thing because you think it's a hot thing or whatever, and then you're going to make it, but you don't really care about it, and people can feel that. So, and that's always what I felt with wrestling comics. And so I wanted to make my own. So I wrote up a pitch for Headlocked, and I put together a business plan, and I took it to publishers. So the first mistake is, people are like, well, where's your art? And I'm like, well, I'm not an artist. I'm a writer. They're like, well, you got to get an art. I'm like, why would I get art? I'm a writer, and you're a comic book company. And you start to learn, just, I guess, from the outside, it looks like such a glamorous form of entertainment. And I think it's very similar to wrestling, like when you're watching as a fan, like you think it's this, this giant, and maybe, WWE is, but obviously when you watch the independents, it's much more of a shoestring operation. And I think that's how comics is too, but you don't see that as a fan. So ultimately, a good chunk of comics, the way most comics are made outside of the biggest, the biggest of the big, is you basically make it and then you pay for the production of it. And then if you're lucky, you'll get some stuff on the back end. And, a lot of publishers are basically an editor and a distributor for the most part. So it's weird. You know what I mean? It's nothing that I understood or expected. So I flailed around there for a while. I got an artist, and then that artist didn't work out. And then I got an artist who did work out. And we made our first book. And then I learned about the direct market. So, I go to comic book stores all the time and buy comics. And you never think, like, I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, this is something that I would want to read. Like, wrestling fans love comics, comic fans, So why wouldn't this be something that somebody would want to carry? But then, wrestling or comics is so dominated by Marvel and DC, especially back then. It was probably, 70% of the market share, 75% of the market share. So, you start to learn about fighting for shelf space and, getting in the book, so there's a book that all these comic stores order out of called Previews. And the top, like, you have to have like a certain amount of the market share to get in the front of the book. And then everybody else goes in the back. And so, you have Marvel and DC and Image and Dark Horse in the front half. And then in the back, you have 200 other small publishers, which makes it kind of difficult to get any kind of traction. So, all of these things are working against me, and I had no idea. And so you just keep having to pivot. So for me, the solution was to take it directly to wrestling fans. So, I would sell it out of my backpack at wrestling shows. I would set up tables at indie shows. And I worked 2 jobs for over a year to put together the first money for a print run, to pay for art, pay for printing, to pay for some convention tables. And then, I just went out and took it out to people directly because nobody was doing that. And so it was kind of a space that, I had to myself, but I still had to go, stand in front of people and, ring the bell, so to speak. So, so that was how it started. And then from there, I started to attract the attention of wrestlers who like comics. Guys like Hurricane, Christopher Daniels, Rob Van Dam, I would see them at Comic-Cons as fans. And nobody at Comic-Con, it seems weird now, given what you and I do at Comic-Con. But back in the day, there was you didn't have wrestling at Comic-Con. Like, maybe there'd be a couple guys doing autographs. And if there were, it was largely, Virgil, Greg Valentine, and Honky Tonk Man. And they're not there because they love comics. They're just there to sign some autographs and whatever. So as a wrestling fan, it's not even really represented at Comic-Con. So for a while, I'm I'm like a unicorn in this space. And I still am at some shows to a certain extent. But, so I attracted these wrestlers, and then they would help me spread the word. Like, guys like, Shane has been such a help, in terms of, because he was, the Hurricane and the wrestling superhero and whatever. So his weight, his word with comics carries some weight. Rob Van Dam, owned a comic book store, his word carried some weight, and that sort of helped me, get established. But a lot of the paths that I built, did not exist, so there's a machete and you're out in the brush, just cutting a trail. And, I like to make the joke that, I cleared all the rocks off the campground and now these guys are trying to pitch a tent in my yard, but
yeah, well,
go ahead.
Yeah, as for us at Mass Republic and the approach that we took with the Luchaverse, while not necessarily for the exact same reasons, in the end, I guess it sort of was to some extent. me not being a writer or comic book artist, I had to find both. And I knew that because of the IP rights, I wanted to make sure that we did own and write, print, publish basically ourselves and with our publishing partner from the beginning, as we attempt still at this point to go out and now develop it for film and TV. But, being in that same position in terms of, do we even go and try to work with a larger label? Like you said, in 12, 13 years ago, there was creator-owned content. Image Comics back in the 90s was built off of, these creator-owned properties, but it absolutely wasn't like it is today, where there's an entire business model for half the industry of kind of a consistent formula and format for creating and taking your comic, your scripts and your artists and going to a publishing company and working with them. Like you said, for the independents, whether by choice or by just the way that things worked out, it is really, really hard to make that noise. And with Diamond being the way that most comic book stores only buy, because they like the convenience of having one place to shop for all their comics. Now it's a little bit different because in the last month or two, DC has kind of changed that game, but it's another podcast for another time. So the way that you kind of immediately pivoted, or after some of these first experiences pivoted to doing it on your own. And as you mentioned, starting to work with some of these wrestling superstars who had large followings, who had a public awareness. Which came first, the move to Kickstarter for funding, or starting to do the not main storyline volumes of Headlocked, but the ones that were kind of co-written short stories with the talent?
So, they actually kind of came together. So, we'd published the first volume of Headlocked, and I had taken it around. My first initial thought was, if we could really, put on a show at conventions and sell a lot of books and create a little buzz, then the publishers would come to me. They'd be like, hey, this guy's got big lines at Comic-Con and he's selling all his books and blah, 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 that we should get in on this action. Because I still kind of needed distribution. And this is, 2010, 11, 12. I'm going through this. And it's a much slower process back then. So by this time I've got Jerry Lawler doing my covers, and I'm, just hitting shows and just trying to build something. But I'm still pursuing publishers at this point, smaller publishers, just to get it into stores. Because my feeling is, if I can get it on the shelf, I can drive people to it if I have to. But then it's just, it's the same. It was the same problem. People just weren't into it. I had I was talking about it, but I had a guy from a major publisher laugh in my face. And another guy from a major publisher, he let me make my pitch. The third word in my pitch was wrestling. And he said, wrestling? Yeah, not interested. And, and so on and so forth. And even the people who liked wrestling, I'd had these publishers come to get their picture taken with Jerry and come to get his autograph and whatever, but couldn't see the value in what we were doing. And that part of it is extremely frustrating, but I kind of understand, your customers of the direct market. And if the direct market isn't, if they think wrestling comics don't sell because of years of awful WWE license books, then, you know what I mean? Like, they just see a wrestling comic and they're like, it's not going to go anywhere.
And we'll be back in just a few moments with more with Michael Kingston as we get into details specifically about how he's worked with many of these pro wrestling superstars throughout the years. But first, let's head over to Lucha Central and check in with Denise Salcedo for what's on the network on all the other shows this week.
Hey everyone, it's Denise Salcedo here in Lucha Central with a reminder of where and when to catch your favorite shows each week or when to try a new one. Tuesdays, it's the Lucha Underground centered show, Mass Mats and Mayhem. Check out the premiere video stream every Tuesday at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern on the Lucha Central YouTube channel and at luchacentral.com. Then listen to it on your favorite podcast platform every Wednesday. Also on Tuesdays, it's Tuesday Wrestle Boss with Fabi Chulo, live covering pro wrestling and MMA from 7 to 8:30 p.m. Pacific. Head to WrestleBossLive.com to listen live and even call in or download it Wednesday across podcast platforms. Wednesday nights, live on Facebook, it's Spanish show La Mesa de los Márgaros, giving you both the news and the chisme from around the lucha world. Find the video version on Facebook Wednesday through Friday, and then Saturdays, download the audio version in podcast form. Thursdays, it's Straight Out of the Bodega with Papo Esco and PWR promoter Gabriel Ramirez. Guests from throughout the wrestling world make this a must-listen series, and this week, El Rudo de las Chicas, Sam Adonis, joins the show to talk about his non-traditional route to the main event of Arena Mexico, first making a name for himself in the UK and then Mexico and more. On Friday, it's your double dose of Lucha Central Weekly podcast, one in English y el otro en español. Lucha Central Weekly is where you'll find all the top stories of the week, both inside and out of the ring from Mexico and anywhere luchadores are in action across the globe. Find out what's happening in empty arenas across Mexico, including Chaos, Lucha Time, and the latest from Mas Lucha, as well as lucha action in WWE, NXT, and AEW. Also, if you missed any of last week's shows, including Vampiro on Lucha Libre Figures and Facts, Boss Fight Studios' Eric Araña on Business of the Business, or Thunder Rosa on Mass Mats and Mayhem, LuchaCentral.com has links to it all for you. Be sure to subscribe and follow all your favorite Lucha Central Network series on your favorite podcast platforms. And please be sure to give a rating and review to help more fans find the shows that you love. For now, this is Denise Salcedo signing off from Lucha Central. Have a great week.
Yeah, and I think, even for us, when we're out here developing not just comics, but whether it's publishing in traditional books or TV, film, whatever, even for us with our focus in Lucha Libre and us trying to sell it more as Hispanic heroes as opposed to Hispanic wrestlers, there was absolutely a publishing pitch that we did not that long ago where the person was just like, kind of like what you just said, like, oh, wrestling doesn't sell. And I was like, if that's how they truly see this property and it's all they see in it, then even if they did think it was going to sell, they are not going to know how to market this. They're not going to know how to position this. They're not going to know how to promote it. They're not going to believe in it. And I think that's only kind of inspired us for that particular series to look into, again, kind of doing something more direct to consumer. So I absolutely understand that frustration and that plight. And so at some point you transition from trying to just self-fund these books, still working multiple jobs, I think, right? But
yes.
The crowdfunding world has just really started to open up. Again, we're talking many years ago. It's not what it is today, or what it was not then, what it was today. And as far as I recall, in terms of at least a graphic novel presentation of wrestling, and maybe all, you can obviously tell me, you were really early with Kickstarter.
Early-ish, yeah. I think we ran it in 2013. I had a couple friends that had successful campaigns, and I started looking around, and I saw some people making some big money, and I mean, the one thing is obviously I've always believed in what we do, and I know that there's an audience for it if you can just get people to take some time to consider it. So my goal, though, was with Kickstarter, the plan, and this is where the short stories come in, is, we got to do something because I've got such a convention presence at this point where, I'll basically see I'll see the same people every year at the same convention. So for, the last 3-4 years, that's been the model. So every, San Diego, what do you got new? And they buy it and they buy it and they buy it. But now I need them to transition to a different platform. So I need to make it attractive. So my plan was to have content that I collaborated with several wrestlers on, and for this first book, it was the original guys. It was Hurricane, Rob Van Dam, Christopher Daniels, Ken Anderson did a piece of art, Sin Bodhi did a piece of art, Sam Shaw, Dexter Loomis, he did a piece of art. And that content was only available on Kickstarter. And so you could buy the book from me at a convention, but it was going to have 30 less pages in it. And that is how we've managed to get people to transition to this different platform. We give them a better book. And it hasn't hurt our sales at conventions at all. I mean, you know what I mean? We just had to get enough of the people from the convention, the convention and online store buying thing to go to the Kickstarter just to get enough to be able to fund the book. And then once it's funded, I mean, the model's still the same. You're doing shows, you're selling online, we're going to wrestling shows and all that. So it worked out great, so we started collaborating on this content together, and we do short stories. And then that became our way to, and now, I mean, we generally get funded very quickly. Usually within the first week and a half, because you build up a fan base and, they know to get in on it early.
So let's take a step back for a moment and talk about the collaborating with these actual wrestling superstars. And let's first talk Jerry Lawler, because that was something that became part of the Headlocked process and Headlocked books very early on. And with Jerry Lawler, for those who are listening that don't really know the wrestling world, you have a WWE Hall of Famer, somebody who is very well known to wrestling fans in Memphis, Tennessee, where he's from and based. He is a local legend, local hero. Back in the day, the TV ratings for Memphis wrestling, were more than 50% of the city of Memphis were watching on their TV sets at that time. So he's got quite a history, and was known somewhat for his art. There's a great classic story of, his very first thing he ever did in wrestling was he sent in a drawing of his to the Memphis Wrestling Show back when he was young, and they showed it on air. And so you've got this celebrity who is also an artist, and you end up in a position where he's doing Norman Rockwell-esque covers for your books. How did that relationship come together? And, what was it like the first time you started to kind of put together the business dealings with him, in terms of, was this something that you were anxious about, or did you think this was an easy sell, or how were you approaching it, and how did it happen?
It's just the dumbest thing, man. I mean, it still always feels very surreal to me. But I sent him an email through his website, but literally forgot I did it after I did it. Like, it was almost a lark to me. Like, I was like, yeah, Jerry Lawler does art. Maybe I can get him to do a cover for me, So I sent him an email, and then maybe like 2 weeks later, I get a response back. And it's, hey, I'd love to look at your books. Send me some books. Here's my address. In my mind, I'm still dealing with a webmaster. I mean, I know now that Jerry answers his own email, but back then I just assumed he had like a webmaster or something. There's a network of people behind Jerry, but that's not who he is, And then maybe about a week after I sent him out, I get a phone call and I work at night. I'm at work, and I work in a warehouse, and it's loud and whatever, and I have to duck into this little shipping office, and He's like, "Hey, Mike, this is Jerry Lawler," and I'm like, if there was a way to fake a voice, I would have assumed it was a gag, but obviously his voice is so distinct. And he was like, "Yeah," he's like, I'd love to do this. I always wanted to come back around. The reason he, as you mentioned, the reason he got into wrestling was through sending his drawings into Memphis Wrestling. And he's like, I always wanted to circle back around to do art. And so he said that, he goes, I'd love to do it. I was like, oh, that's great. And so the other thing about Jerry is that he's an amazing artist. But he's also, he's a super busy guy. Like, he's his own little industry. He's doing, at the time, he's doing voiceovers for Monday Night Raw. He's still wrestling on the weekends. He's doing video game voiceovers down, at Stanford, or, so he's all over the place. Super busy. Also, he's a world champion procrastinator. So every piece of art he's ever done looks exactly like Norman Rockwell did it. And it was done in a day, and it was done on the day that it had to be done. And originally, super nerve-wracking, just because, in my mind, I'm like, come on, let's get this thing done, So, so I met him at a show at he wrestled a lot for Northeast Wrestling up here. So, and most of those shows are close to my house. So I met him after a show, and he's like, I put some stuff together. I want you to take a look at it. So he showed me a sketch, and I was like, oh, this looks great. I'm 100% good with this. Just let me know when you finish. So then nothing. And so finally I'm like, listen, I got to have this on this day. And he's like, okay. He's like, I'll have it done when, and there happened to be another Northeast Wrestling show in another part of the Northeast. So he's like, I'll have it done at the show. So I get to the show, and I see him. He goes, all right. He goes, I didn't get a chance to finish it, but he goes, I'll finish it overnight, and I'll have it for you in the morning. All right, fine. So I leave the show. I drive home like 2.5 hours. I drive back 2.5 hours, and I go to his hotel. And he's like, yeah, I'm just sitting down to work on it. Okay. And he takes it out, and it's the exact same sketch he showed me like 2 months ago. So he hadn't touched it in 2 months. So, and then he sat down and he worked on it. And it was, first of all, it's amazing to watch him work, because he's such an amazing artist, and he's so, like, he's just a natural talent. Like, and he's always been a natural talent. Like, some people just have it, and some people have to work at it, So, and so the hotel door's open, and I'm sitting on the bed, and I'm watching him work, and like wrestlers are walking by, and like, Samoa Joe was on that show, and he like comes in and sits on the bed, and we're watching Jerry paint. Like, it's so cool, and I had met Joe, before that. And guys are just popping in and out watching Jerry, do his thing,
awesome.
And then he finishes it, and he gives it to me, and I take it home. And he, it's a bang up job. It's amazing, and then, now I'm used to it. We've been talking during the pandemic, because he's got to do a cover for Tales from the Road, and, he hasn't done it. And at some point I'm just going to be like, listen, I need it by this day. And then he's going to do it on that day, and it's going to be amazing. And it is what it is. And I have a comfort level with it now, but at the beginning it was super nerve wracking.
Yeah, I can imagine. So like you mentioned, Lawler at the time, under a WWE contract, doing voiceovers for Monday Night Raw, but also wrestling independently. At any point in time, was his WWE contract of concern with doing this project? Did that ever enter into it?
No, because he was on an announcer deal. So the announcers have more freedom to do outside stuff. So, that's why I was able to use him early on. Booker T did a piece of art for my second book, my second Kickstarter. I've talked to Corey Graves before about doing something. Like, the guys that are just on straight announcing deals, they don't have the same type of issue. And as I've come to find out, I mean, I'm not going to name names, but there's guys obviously that have done work for me while under WWE contract, and WWE doesn't really give me a hard time. They've never given me a hard time about anything. One time, one of their trademark lawyers was upset or not upset at me, but at a show for using a picture they owned of Jerry, and which was weird to me because he was their employee at the time, and they made us switch it. But other than that, I guess what I was told is that, they turn over these guys all the time that are looking for trademark infringement, and like when they start, they're always like super hardcore. That's how you end up with stuff like that, and then they sort of ease into the job, and then they're like, "Oh, this isn't a big deal." So, but for the most part, I've never had an issue with WWE ever. They've always been hands off. They've never given me a hard time. So I've been pretty lucky in that regard.
Excellent. So then you moved on, as you mentioned, and you put together this first book that included stories or art by known talents: Hurricane Helms, Ken Anderson, Sin Bodhi, Booker T. So let's talk a little bit. So we're first off, were all of those talents just completely independent at the time? Were any of them under contract anywhere, or was this kind of, for most of them, in their first post WWE period?
I think so. Rob might have been under contract to Impact, possibly, but I don't think so. I think that they were all. Daniels was definitely under contract with Impact at the time. Well, TNA, as it were. But I don't know if Rob was yet. But for the most part, I think, Helms, I think, was a free agent at that point. I think Helms was under contract to, he did that, was it American Lucha? What the hell was that? In the West Coast, there was some, like, Lucha thing. And, he was in it, and Molina and somebody, whatever. He was under contract with them. He had their belt and everything. Yeah, I mean, nobody ever really, I've never had an issue with anybody contractually. So, I mean, I'm kind of under everybody's radar. And honestly, I'm not using anybody's likeness when I do it. You know what I mean? I use them as authors of stories. So that's usually what people get upset about.
Yeah, that was my next question. In terms of kind of the versions of the names you use of talent, or, is that, Hurricane Helms, is it Shane Helms that you have to use? Can you use the Hurricane name? Those types of questions, are those things you have to really take into consideration when you're considering how you're listing people?
I mean, I haven't, and I probably should, but, sometimes, I mean, like right now, I mean, I've, Dolph Ziggler's doing a story for the book for Tales from the Road, and he is obviously under contract. So, but he has a little bit of freedom because he does comedy and he's got so much tenure there. Like, he's got it worked into his contract. That's not that big of a deal. So he, I guess I've used his name, and he hasn't said not to. So, I mean, everything seems like it's been fine. I don't know. Like I said, I've been pretty lucky to avoid all that stuff. But
good. So let's talk a little bit about the actual process when you're co-writing stories with some of these talents. What is that like? Where does that process normally begin? And are you dealing with kind of a range of these set of talents? They really want to be involved with the story, and they're with me every step of the way. As opposed to, I know that for example, when we worked together to bring Penta Zero M to your book, it was really more of a outline of a story and some kind of key ideas, and then you went and wrote a story that he looked at and said, "This is awesome," and you kind of work together that way. So, how does it kind of usually break down when you're working with the talents?
It's different for everybody. Like Mick Foley wrote like a whole prose story that was probably about 24 pages of story that we had to, it was supposed to be 6, but I probably could have been a whole issue. And I think we got it down to 9 pages, which kind of was a difficult, just a thing we had to work around. like if we were a bigger publisher, like that had like very tight, schedules and budgets and weights and stuff or whatever, it probably would have been an issue. But I just added 3 more pages to the book. There's a little flexibility in being smaller, I guess. But Chris Daniels wrote like an actual comic script. I had just finished a story with Shad Gaspard right before he passed. Well, actually, it was Crime Time, but he sent like a whole thing with like panel layouts and stuff.
Oh wow!
And but he had done storyboarding and stuff for his, and he was a screenwriter and he had written some comics in the past too. So it's different for everybody. When I did the story with Ric Flair, like we sat down and we had some drinks and we just sort of went, I presented an idea and then we went back and forth a little bit and then, I wrote it, I sent it to him and then, he gives me some notes, kind of the same way that Penta's deal was. And, and then we get to a point where we're happy with it. So, different people have different, I try to get most of it, in the first pass. Like I don't, for the most part, I feel like I know what I'm doing now. And I generally, you get some notes here and there, but nothing major. No one's ever been like, I hate this or whatever.
That's good.
We get that part out early, the macro stuff. And then, if you got to change a couple things, it's not a big deal.
So let's kind of, I guess, jump forward to where you are now. I guess there's a few different pieces to this. Obviously, 2020, for trying to do self-promoted, self-distributed, convention and live event based comic book sales, not the best year. And in the midst of this all, you launched your most recent Kickstarter, which, like you mentioned, kind of as tendency has with your stuff, out the gate did tremendous right away. So I guess let's take a step back to the current campaign and the current book. Kind of walk us through a little bit about where are we in the kind of the overall Headlock saga, and what is the kind of roster of bonus content that's been put together for this current campaign that people can still get in on.
So, Headlocked itself is this one, the story of Mike Hartman, and it's his journey through the wrestling business. Now, obviously, that gives us a very narrow focus on what what you see. You know what I mean? If you're a kid in wrestling school, you're aware of wrestlers and stuff. You know the universe, but you don't see anybody. You see the people you go to wrestling school with and that little ecosystem that you exist in. So I took the opportunity when we were creating these stories with different wrestlers to just sort of build out corners of the universe. You build out locales, you introduce characters, and some of them are, some of them you might never see in the main Headlock book. Some of the places, will eventually take Mike Hartman through. It's, and some of them are just fun stories that, you got something to say, we want to say it, so it's a little mixture, the stories are a little mixture of stuff. Some of them are little side stories with characters that exist in the series, and some of them are brand new characters. So it's fun to play around. We do, stories, and Headlocked is a straight drama, like you said, like sort of a prestige cable drama type story. But the stories and Tales from the Road are in a variety of different genres. We did a story with Dominik Dijakovic, and I still want to call him Dijak, but that's sort of a horror-based story. And we just did a story with Taya that's a secret agent story. And, the story with Gangrel involves Bigfoot. And they're all like just super fun stories. But they all deal with wrestling, and, for the most part, we're able to tie them all back into some sort of reality. but it just gives us an opportunity to sort of tell different kinds of stories and flex our muscles a little bit in some other genres, and that it makes it fun for me too, because it kind of gives me an opportunity to do a little bit of everything all under the same umbrella. So, I watched that terrible Cats adaptation that they did not too long ago, and then my mind gets thinking, I'm like, man, can I do like a Cats-based wrestling story? You know what I mean? And sometimes you just, and it's fun because then it gets your mind going, and then you start, it's like a puzzle, and you try to figure your way through it. And that's the kind of stuff that sort of creatively excites me. So, whenever I'm dealing with talent, I know their time is limited, and anybody that's doing stuff for me is doing me a favor, so I try not to waste people's time. So I usually try to come with a couple of ideas for them. So then you try to think about, who they are, what they're about, so when I did a story with Kenny Omega, I'm like, yeah, we're going to want to do a video game story, and when he pitched the story idea for Taya, my mind went to Lucha, and maybe we make it and we made it a riff on, Santo movies. So I try to come with a couple of different ideas that are somewhat, related to that person and their, and their character and, the things that they're into, because you want them to be excited about it too. But, figuring that out is half the fun.
So in just looking, I jumped onto the Kickstarter page real quick. So stories in this current edition by Christopher Daniels, who's a part of AEW, Dolph Ziggler, WWE, Dominik Dijakovic, NXT, Gangrel, who's a former WWE superstar, Hurricane Helms, who's not only a WCW, WWE superstar, but works behind the scenes now at WWE, Joey Janela, AEW superstar, Michael Kingston, who'd be you, Mustafa Ali, WWE superstar, MVP, WWE superstar, Rob Van Dam, Impact superstar, former WWE superstar, Samoa Joe, WWE superstar, Taya Valkyrie, Impact Wrestling, Young Bucks from AEW. That's a killer lineup, and it's not like, it's not just WWE wrestlers, not just Impact. You've got talent from across the spectrum, a long list of artists who are known artists, whether they're kind of more underground known artists or whether they're, people who have credits with some of the bigger companies. I really love the cover that I saw from Jay Gonzo for the Taya story. I think that's a great one. And so I guess, again, just to kind of reiterate the model, if somebody wants the version of the latest edition of the drama that includes all these stories, you've got to get in on the Kickstarter version, right? That's not the version that will later be sold at conventions and at shows, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. So the date on this is, let's see, I just had seen it.
It's on July 27th.
All right. So if you are listening to this,
right after Monday Night Raw.
All right. So if you're listening to this prior to July 27th, definitely head over to Kickstarter and check out Headlocked. Just look up Headlocked. I'll put the link to it in the summary of this episode as well. And then if by chance you are listening to this after, you can always go to the Headlocked website and purchase the back issues, and you can wait until this is completed to pick it up. But I've been, even before Michael and Master Republic started working together, sharing convention space, I was a fan of the book. I have every single edition from the very beginning, and that's one of the reasons why it was a lot of fun to be able to team up with Michael and start doing conventions together. Generally, we do San Diego Comic Con together, and it's been great to see, like Michael mentioned, there's this Headlocked fan base that every year I'm seeing coming back and picking up the latest books and coming to see, what stars are signing at the booth. And I guess that's really, another part of the business model. Like, I guess you did mention that towards the beginning of, bringing these stars to conventions. A lot of these are still hot, on TV today stars. So they're bringing that foot traffic to the booth for people to come see them. And hopefully they're learning about, a lot of them are learning about Headlocked, for the first time, picking up books. And also in terms of the Kickstarter, depending on the level that people jump in at, you can get back issues as well to kind of catch up on the main story as to where it is. We've mentioned a couple of times now that this is a very premium cable type of a story. I'm sure at some point you've had thoughts of taking it off of the page and onto the screen. Is there anything in that direction that you can kind of talk about that journey at this point?
I mean, there's always smoke. I mean, I had a little dalliance with The Rock there for a minute. But that was right sort of when he became like it happened right when he became like Disney Superman. And I think that the material was probably darker than he wanted to be associated with at that point, which is unfortunate. But, because I feel like if I had caught him like 5 years prior, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
maybe you make Headlocked instead of Ballers, But, and I understand, he's got a brand and he is a very brand oriented man. So, and there's always people sniffing around and, I get emails, here and there. And I've talked to TV writers and producers and all of that stuff. And it's fun. It's at least nice that people are more open to it now. For years I would go to San Diego and I would have, before the first couple of years after like X-Men hit at the box office, like nobody understood comics. They just knew that comic book movies were hot, and you just have Hollywood people randomly wandering around Comic-Con and just looking at stuff to potentially option. And it was an interesting time. Now everybody kind of knows who the players are and you have your meetings and none of that stuff really happens on the floor. It's all kind of set. But, for a while you would just see these producers and stuff. And, I would meet people with varying levels of interest. But one of the things that people would always say to me that I always found amusing was, well, they already made the wrestling movie. And
yeah.
And I'm like, I don't understand. I was like, well, I guess it's a good thing they didn't tell the guys that made Goodfellas that, they already made the mob movie, right? And, but the weirdest you hear so much. So
I know.
Bad excuses. And, but it's funny because people get in their own bubble. I mean, this is a fun story, but I was at C2E2 one year with and the showrunner for Lucha Underground came to my table and, because we had a bunch of people there and I was telling him about Headlocked and he was like, yeah, I don't really read comics. And I'm like, listen, how are you of all people going to do that to me? And he goes, what do you mean? I'm like, how many people have you had to tell Lucha Underground isn't like wrestling? And he goes, oh man, he goes, I did. He goes, I just did that to you. People do that to me all the time. He didn't even realize that he had done that. You know what I mean? Because you end up with your own preconceived notions and you end up in your own little bubbles and stuff. And that's always been the hardest thing, is dealing with sort of the preconception that people outside of the wrestling business have of wrestling. And then for me, also the sort of misconceptions people have about comics. Because when people think about comic book movies, they don't think about History of Violence or Road to Perdition or Ghost World. They think about superheroes. A lot of times people say comic books when they mean superheroes. Mm-hmm. So doing a straight drama, no one's doing a straight drama in comics. I think except for me. Everything's got genre elements in it. But, I'm doing a straight drama because, nobody was doing wrestling comics when I was doing them either. So, I guess I've always got to be difficult.
Well, I wish you nothing but the best. I think it goes without saying at this point. I think it definitely deserves to be developed for the screen. I understand the journey. Honestly, my decision to do the Luchaverse as a comic book universe stems from a lot of the things that you talked about. I kind of got tired of trying to sell Hollywood on essentially rebooting the lucha libre film genre of the 60s and 70s and having people have, this excuse or that excuse for what I thought were bad excuses for why it didn't make sense. And I was seeing all of these comic books get optioned for film and TV, some that were definitely, I thought, things that would make awesome film and TV, and a lot of them that I thought were kind of head scratchers, and a lot of them that to this day have not seen the light of day in terms of fully being developed into a TV pilot or being developed into a film, and I know some properties just take forever. I mean, Lock and Key, I think the story with that was that there was at least 2, if not 3 different signed deals, pilots made, things put together, and it took a decade or whatever it was for Lock and Key to get made for Netflix earlier this year. And I decided that we would put the pen to the paper and we would create the Luchaverse of the comic book universe. And I was very adamant with our partner on that, Ivan Plaza at Cheeto Comics, that this wasn't just a cheap play to have a book in our hands and say, hey, okay, now let's develop this. I wanted to make sure that the comic books absolutely stood on their own as comic books, and that, worst case scenario, hopefully we broke even on the comics and we nothing else ever happened. But it's the same type of a situation as we've talked to people more so on the publishing side and kind of getting that, oh, wrestling's been done, or oh, wrestling doesn't sell, or it's just Mexican wrestling, when it's like, no, this is superheroes. We're telling superhero stories, we're telling horror stories, or we're telling comedy, action adventure stories, and it just so happens that they star luchadors, but don't wrap this all into this impression that you might have of it until you've actually taken a look at what it is that we're bringing to the table. And so I feel your pain. I wish you nothing but the best, not only in this current Kickstarter, but hopefully people understanding and seeing this amazing story world that you've created that has so much potential, across the books that have already been released, but where to even go from here. And as well, I've really enjoyed the collaborations with the talent. So anybody listening that has even a remote interest in comic books or, pro wrestling storytelling that's not done inside the ring, I encourage you to check out Kickstarter, get in on this Tales from the Road, and pick up the previous one as well. Of course, personally, I'm very much looking forward to the Taya Valkyrie one, not only because she is a Master Republic Legends of Lucha Libre client, but I love where you're going with it and with the story, harkening back to the old Lucha films. Like I mentioned, the cover by Jay Gonzo or the art for it by Jay Gonzo is looking incredible. So, Michael, I guess just to wrap it up, obviously we've talked about the Kickstarter, but where else can people find and follow your adventures and Headlock's adventures, and know when conventions start again, how to find you at a show?
Everything, all our social media is Headlocked Comic. It's one word, and it's all run by me. So, I'm usually not hard to find if people got questions, or, a few questions about the books, or if you're trying to break into comics and you want to hear about all the mistakes not to make. I can tell you all the things I did so you can not do them. But it's been a labor of love. And, if it never becomes anything more than a comic book, I only really ever set out to make a cool comic book, and it's already exceeded my wildest dreams. Like when you see the list of people that, I have in this book, like it's a dream come true, So, Hurricane was, as a comic book fan, Hurricane was one of my favorite wrestlers, and now he's one of my best friends. And how it's just all, How crazy is that? So, I mean, everything's good for me. I'm working on house money at this point.
All right. Well, that's good. That's good. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing what's next for Headlock. Thanks for once again joining me on Business of the Business. It was great to talk with Michael about the comic book world. Next episode, we're going to jump back into the toy and action figure world. But, oh man, it's going to be so much more than that. I think that when it comes to just interesting and inspiring and motivated business people that I know, this one ranks up near the top, if not at the top. So I am excited to be back 2 weeks from now with the next episode of Business of the Business, and it will be dropping on the same day that the AEW action figures drop at Walmart, and my guest will be the man responsible for making that happen. Talk to you in 2 weeks. For now, follow Masked Republic at Masked Republic and get all of your Lucha Libre news every day at luchacentral.com.
If you're listening to this and you haven't visited luchacentral.com, it's time to do it. luchacentral.com is the online home for Lucha Libre, where you can get all of the top news in English and in Spanish. Find the best curated video content and original content not seen anywhere else. Find when Lucha Libre events would be happening in your area. Find photo galleries from top photographers covering Lucha Libre around the world. From weekly polls to annual awards. Seen and read by top executives in all of the major Lucha Libre promotions across the globe. And on top of that, it's free. LuchaCentral.com, your centralized place for all things Lucha Libre.